Today we're going to look at trauma in the developing brain, specifically trauma and resilience. The objectives, trust me, we'll talk about more than two of each. We'll talk about trauma first, and then we'll talk about resilience. Paul MacLean in the 1960s proposed this lovely triune brain model. It's a very elegant way of looking at how the brain functions. And he separated the brain into three areas: the surviving brain, which is the brainstem and the cerebellum, the feeling brain, which is in the middle where all the emotions happen, and the thinking brain, which is the cortex, which is all this wrinkly stuff on top. It's good to know the various names that are referred to these various parts of the brain and their functions. Just understanding that the surviving brain takes care of the most basic functions. The feeling brain takes care of feelings and encoding of memories, taking care of where things are, and assessing one's surroundings. It's important to note also that the feeling brain works about twice as fast as the thinking brain, but it is not nearly as elegant. It assesses things at more of a global and broad strokes level. And then finally, the thinking brain, and that takes care of our thoughts, our movements, our narrative memory, our life story, our sense of awareness, all of the executive functions that are so important to learning and functioning in the world. Let's sit for a minute and look at a list of executive functions, because often we hear executive functions referred to without ever breaking them down. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's nice to know the types of skills being inferred when one uses the catch-all term executive functions. And you'll find different lists scattered throughout the literature, but this gives you a really good general idea of what we're talking about when we talk about executive functions. The effects of trauma on the developing brain. It's important to remember resilience can still be developed after a traumatic beginning in life, because talking about traumatic effects on the developing brain can get kind of depressing, so stay with me here. Development is use dependent. The parts of our brain that get used the most develop the most. Brain cells stay undifferentiated until inner and external cues cause them to organize. If those inner and external cues are positive, then the brain will develop that way. If they are negative, then the brain will develop that way. So it's really important to understand that the stimulation of the child organizes the brain cells and structures. Otherwise, they just do not get organized. The development that happens, it requires a Goldilocks level of quantity of stimulation, just enough, not too much, not too little. The patterns of stimulation, what happens on a regular basis and becomes predictable, and obviously a nurturing kind of stimulation, so that the youngster knows that they belong and that they're safe. Effects of trauma on the brain continue. At the architectural level, neural networks are the foundation of brain function, and neural firings depend on these primarily these three neurotransmitters. There's another one, glutamate, but that's more for just life as opposed to anamines that direct behavior. Norepinephrine is the precursor for adrenaline. It means I'm excited. Dopamine is the motivational neurotransmitter, and serotonin is the satisfaction neurotransmitter. Trauma disrupts all three of these monoamines, and that means the trauma affects nearly all the neural firings and neural networks across the brain, particularly at the lower levels. And what that means is that all higher level functions are disrupted. Here's a quick rundown of the way trauma affects particular brain structures. The hippocampus, which is the structure that takes care of memory and locations, it gets smaller, and it means less ability to encode memories and remember where things are. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. It's a tract of neurons, neural fibers, beautiful thing that allows the two halves of the brain to communicate, and this actually gets smaller with trauma as well, meaning the two halves of the brain do not communicate as well, with all of the implications there too. The cerebellum at the very back of the brain, there's more and more research being done on the cerebellum and its functions and use in the brain. It decreases volume as well, meaning less physiological regulation and less fine motor control, and importantly, less capacity to develop executive functions. Further effects, the prefrontal cortex, that's all the wrinkly matter on top, that's where all the executive functions happen, decreases volume as well under trauma, which means less ability for things like self-control, perspective taking, social functioning, emotional regulation. The amygdala scans the environment for fear and threat all the time. This gets more sensitive and increases in activity in a traumatic environment, meaning more and more frequent hair trigger alerts to threats. As the amygdala become more sensitive and fire more frequently, saying to the person, I'm under attack or I'm under threat, this is known as kindling. When a person has a lot of threat and traumatic stress, the cortisol levels in their brain and body become very dysregulated. And that means there's lower energy resources, and it has negative effects on the ability to learn and socialize. It increases externalizing disorders, things like acting out, and it increases our vulnerability to autoimmune disease. Trauma decreases neural firings. It decreases conductance, so the firings happen at a slower rate, which means a person thinks more slowly. They react more slowly. Decreases neural connectivity. There are fewer neural networks in the brain. It decreases brain metabolism. It dysregulates adrenaline and norepinephrine, which means a person bounces between inertia and hyperactivity. It decreases the number of neurons, axons, and synapses in the brain, and with physical abuse, actual structural damage can occur. How the brain processes trauma? The classic fight, flight, freeze response. If you think you're strong enough, you're going to fight. If you think you're fast enough, you're going to flee. If you don't think you're strong or fast enough, you're going to freeze. And if you think your life is about to end, you're going to faint. That's just the way the response happens. Also, the amygdala take over and they gate all sensory input for scanning for threat and trauma, which means the frontal cortex just suspends and the instinctive survival mechanisms engage and take over, and that means executive functions just are inaccessible and they stop. Emotional regulation disrupted by fear. Emotional regulation that is disrupted by fear means that the person is overwhelmed, the fear is all-encompassing, and it's enduring. When you get into patterns like this, it's really hard for a youngster to engage the executive functions that we need them to do in order to learn. A fearful brain is a brain that just is in this threat stress response all the time. It's important to remember that this threat response starts in the brainstem. It's so far away from executive function control, prefrontal cortex control. It cannot be controlled by willpower. This happens at a very, very basic survival level in a person, and it hijacks the frontal cortex. It prevents executive functions from happening, and this can create a use-dependent change in the brain if it happens frequently enough. It'll actually reset the brain into a chronic fight, flight, freeze response, wherein the brain believes it is basically under threat all the time. And a brain that thinks it is under threat is a fearful brain, and a fearful brain cannot learn, period. Traumatized children are dysregulated and afraid, and that means they cry. And their cries are sharp and edgy, and these cries create frustration for their caregivers, who tend to be very stressed themselves, and then trauma ensues. If this cycle here, these first 4 steps happens enough times, the child learns not to cry, because it both begets trauma and it also doesn't fix anything. It doesn't, the things that cries usually get, which are comfort, don't get that. And so the child learns not to cry. An unusually quiet child is a very worrisome condition. Okay, after all of that, it is important to remember resilience, and let's just talk about that and what it is and why it matters. These are the 4 pillars of resilience for a child. I highly recommend that you find this working paper 13 from Harvard. You can Google it, or you can go to their developingchild.harvard.edu and find this working paper 13 on resilience. These 4 factors are incredibly important. If a person has a reliable adult relationship, it doesn't have to be mom or dad. It can just be a reliable adult who is at least somewhat regular in that child's life. That is an enormous pillar of resilience. Mastery at something, anything, any skill, anything. If a child is good at anything and can develop mastery and a sense of, hey, I can do this, that is a pillar of resilience. Any executive functions, particularly emotional regulation, that the child can develop, that is another pillar of resilience. And then finally, a context of a larger faith identity, and or cultural values, a sense of belonging, a sense of a larger group identity. This is another major pillar of resilience. This comes from my own study of trauma and resilience. It is important to develop more a drive for meaning rather than pursuit of happiness. Our media and advertising tells us pursue happiness, pursue happiness. We even have it in our Constitution. However, drive for meaning is actually more satisfying than pursuing happiness. So help a child develop a sense of hope for the future, and not just a general hope, but an actual vision for the future. Where am I going to be in 2 years, 5 years? What do I want to do? What are my goals? Who do I want to be? Connect the child with his or her core values, and have activities to do this repeatedly will really help youngsters know what they believe, know what they value, and what kind of person they want to be. Repeat this frequently as you can, as the child is capable of doing. Being able to take perspectives, another person's perspective, is an executive function, and it requires both emotional and physiological regulation in order to do that. So if you can get a child emotionally and physically grounded well enough, teach them how to take perspectives. Do this over and over and over again. This is why traumatized people and grieving people have a tough time seeing through their own immediate circumstances, because they're contending with too much dysregulation. If you can teach a child to take perspective, that is a pillar of resilience. Likewise, a willingness to take chances and have a tolerance for setbacks. Taking chances is important, and it takes courage. Traumatized children have a tough time with this because taking chances means sticking one's neck out, and that can be problematic. And they learn not to do that. They learn to hide. Along with taking chances comes this tolerance of setbacks and frustrations. That is important to reframe, that having a failure and having a setback means that the child is actually learning, and that is very, very important to teach the child to tolerate setbacks and to persevere. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. More keys to resilience. Understanding that infants depend on their caregivers. If the caregivers are responsive and safe, then the child learns to self-regulate and is primed for learning. If the caregivers are unsafe, then the child is dealing with dysregulation, and over time, chronic dysregulation. A healthy person requires both a regulated stress response and robust relational bonds. Relational bonds. For the majority of human history, we have been in clans and families. Help a youngster understand you are one of us, you belong, you are welcome here, you are safe. Fostering these relational bonds will do an awful lot to help a child learn. Absolutely. And then remember the principle of use dependence. Just as trauma creates use dependence changes, so does resilience and agency. And the way you create resilience and agency is through the use of patterns and repetition, providing grounding that activate the lower neural networks first, provide security, and provide hope. If you can get these lower neural networks grounded and regulated first, then that leads to higher neural network system development. That is very important to understand. Work at the low stuff before getting to the high stuff. And here are the references. And here, if you want to talk to me, you absolutely can. Email me, call me, we can Zoom, and I'll reach out with you and we can discuss this further. Thanks for listening.